You may have heard of this one before, and if you haven't, you're in for a treat. Gambling Ghoul is a Dandan variant originally created by Messum and featured on the Too Sweet MTG YouTube channel. I'll link the original list and video below in the description, but this video is not just me rehashing their video, as you can clearly see in the 2.0 in the title. You see, I built Messum's original version of this deck and played it with my brother. The problem was, something constantly seemed off as we played it. I had originally intended to just add a small bit about this to the original Dandan video, but I couldn't shake the feeling lurking around the corner that this deck was missing something. It was a brilliant idea after all, fitting incredibly well next to the original Dandan, but each time we played it, there was a glaring issue preventing sublime gameplay, and that was the incentive structures present. Let me restart by briefly explaining the original deck. I'm going to go through it quick though, and if you want a full rundown of the original version, watch Too Sweet MTG's video on it. Speaking of YouTube, we would really appreciate it if y'all would like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us out a ton like you wouldn't believe. Also, if you have any cool ideas for your own Dandan variants and want to see them featured on this channel, feel free to throw them in the comments or join our Discord and post them in the MTG channel. Oh, and go subscribe to Too Sweet MTG as well. Anyway, much like a lot of other Dandan variants, this one is mostly built around a single card. And in this instance, that card is Barrow Ghoul, the ghoul part of the title. This card costs 1 and a black for a 4/4 zombie that has the text at the beginning of your upkeep, sacrifice Barrow Ghoul unless you exile the top creature card in your graveyard. As always, players share a deck and graveyard, so the point is to manipulate the graveyard so that your ghouls will survive and theirs do not. The gambling part of the title comes in the form of random discard cards like Hymn to Torok and Whispers of Emrakul. The former being a sorcery for black that reads target player discards 2 cards at random. The latter only discarding 1 card at random unless you have Delirium. In their deck, there are 4 Hymns and 6 Whispers. These cards are meant to help you fill the grave quickly and fuel your ghouls, which I see still doesn't fully explain the gambling aspect. But what if I mentioned to you that there are also 4 copies of Guerrilla Tactics and 2 copies of Loxodon Smiter? That would add just the spice you were looking for. Of course, you want the card advantage of making your opponent discard 2 cards, and of course you want your ghouls to have fresh meat to eat out of the grave, but are you willing to risk the fallout if your opponent has a Smiter or a Guerrilla Tactics in their hand when you cast it? See, this is a very cool idea and a fun system to be played with, not to mention the 6 copies of Misinformation in the deck, which is an instant for black that allows you to put up to 3 cards from target opponent's graveyard on top of their deck in any order, and since you share a graveyard and deck, well, you can see how that works. Misinformation also allows you to remove creatures from the graveyard to kill opposing ghouls, but also set up some good draws for you and bad draws for your opponent. It's just an all-around fun set of cards chosen for this Dandan variant. However, even the creator themselves noticed a flaw in the design. Players would either run out of cards super fast, or would just stop casting spells altogether to prevent getting caught by the discard Punisher card. The original creator's attempt to partially solve this was a neutral Howling Mine that allowed both players to draw an additional card each turn. This is where the biggest problem I noticed came in, because players could actually just keep drawing cards without having to be proactive at all. Players could stock up on removal and discard Punishers and just play a full control game and be completely safe from danger. This ended up being a mostly optimal strategy, only playing 1 ghoul or even none at most points in the game. Not casting discard spells or ghouls and only playing removal and misinformations to stop the opponent. Now, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with having this BA strategy in a Dandan variant. The issue was that this strategy was mostly optimal and led to us ignoring the main gameplay patterns intended by the creator. If the fun of the format was supposed to be the ghoul and the gambling, this strategy did neither of those things. So that's what I'm here to solve. With Gambling Ghoul 2.0, each of the original creators' intentions have been amplified to the nth degree, and those nagging shortcomings have been hopefully fixed. To start this version 2.0 off, let's talk about what has stayed. Now, my Dandan variants are all increased to 100 cards, so some numbers have been tweaked to accommodate that. Like our good friend Barrow Ghoul. This list now has 14 copies of him. We also have now 4 Loxodon Smiters and the original 4 Guerrilla Tactics, And we've also increased the number of Whispers of Emrakul to 10, but we've chosen to keep the copies of Hymn to Turok down at 4, in order to make the more powerful card show up in a lower comparative frequency. Misinformation has also been reduced down to 4 copies. This card is incredibly fun and interesting in the deck, but too many of them on the whole can prevent a ghoul from ever surviving for even 1 turn. So we sought to reduce that pattern slightly. Lands have mostly remained the same, with the notable removal of cycling lands in favor of 6 Memorial to Folly and 2 Witches' Cottages. Memorial to Folly plays incredibly well in the deck, allowing you to manipulate how many creatures are in the yard to occasionally yoink the last pieces of fuel for an opposing ghoul, but also we had to remove the cycling lands for a reason that we're going to get into later. Next, I want to mention a couple of minor additions that were not in the original list. We added 2 Obstinate Baloth in addition to the other discard punishers, bringing the total up to 10. And you may wonder, why increase the number of these when we had just mentioned that players were not incentivized to cast their discard spells very often? We believe that we've solved this issue in a different way. And in doing so, we have made casting your discard spells so important that the Punisher side of the deck is allowed to blossom, leading to much more exciting and gambling moments. However, to combat these powerful manaless threats, we've also increased the amount of removal slightly, particularly increasing copies of Force of Despair to 4, adding 2 copies of Hagra Mauling, and 2 copies of Tribute to Hunger. Also, you might see both Obstinate Baloth and Tribute to Hunger and think, wait, now you can gain life in this format? Doesn't that kind of throw off the sublime math of fighting with 4/4s? But I like these 2 cards for life gain because in this format, they both perfectly keep the multiples of 4 that make this and original Dandan sublime. Baloth gains 4 when it enters, and every creature in the deck has both 4 power and 4 toughness, so Tribute can only ever gain 4 life. Speaking of gaining life, I was inspired by the fact that Whispers of Emrakul has Delirium, and I wanted to add at least 1 artifact and 1 enchantment into the main deck. So the artifact I chose was Whip of Erebos. Again, can only cause you to gain life in increments of 4, but also can allow you to use ghouls from the grave without ever having to actually pay their upkeep costs. However, Whip is very expensive to use, so you need to commit to it fairly hard. As for the enchantment for Delirium, I chose Omen of the Dead, as it's another instant speed way to remove a creature card from the grave to mess with opposing ghouls. You can also pay 2 and a black, sacrifice it to Scry 2, which allows you to manipulate the top of the deck and add it to the graveyard as an enchantment for Delirium. We also added a big value card in Unseal the Necropolis that essentially mills 6 cards at instant speed and gets you 2 creatures out of the graveyard. It is a super big play that can ensure your ghouls survive and even allow you to grab a Loxodon Smiter right as your opponent casts their Hymn to Turok. Okay, enough of all the smaller changes. Let's go into the big one. The one I think truly pushes this deck into sublime territory. Where the original version put a band-aid on the problem of running out of cards with Howling Mine, my version opted to replace it with a copy of Geth's Grimoire for each player starting in play. If you're unfamiliar, Geth's Grimoire is an artifact that typically costs 4 and reads, whenever an opponent discards a card, you may draw a card. Now do you see why we had to take out the cycling cards? Don't want to be giving our opponents free cards on accident. Your gears also might already be turning. It might be obvious to you, yeah, Hymn to Turok, Whispers, now both draw 2 cards. Awesome, cool. But what may at first seem so simple is the crux to solving the incentives problems of the original. Instead of giving you a free extra card every turn, you now have to cast the random discard spells in order to draw your additional cards. You can't just sit behind removal cards and misinformations to control and stall out the game. You will run out of resources much faster than a player who's casting their discard spell. Additionally, in the older version, if you were playing said control game, sometimes you would just discard down to hand size when you didn't need to cast any spells at the end of turn, but here, if you do that, then your opponent will draw a card for each card you discard. Either way, you are now much more incentivized to actually play the cards in your hand proactively. Where you might still have concerns is with the discard punishers. Now that we have increased the number of them, you might think that this conflicts with my original goal. And that was also a concern of mine at first as well, until we actually played it a bunch. Instead, you still almost always were okay with taking that risk unless you somehow knew that your opponent's entire hand was punishers, because even if they got a Loxodon Smiter out of your discard, you also got to draw cards for consolation, and all in all, players are much more incentivized to play proactively with this change. You want to get your ghouls on the board if you can and hope to stock the grave enough to keep them alive, while both players are slinging discard spells back and forth to claw back value from one another. There's so much back and forth going on here, and it's a ton of fun. I know it may not seem like we've changed much from the original, but trust me, if you try both versions, you will see and feel a massive difference in the incentives built between the two lists. Anyway, as always, let's talk through a match, shall we? The match we have today is a good example of how not to play this deck well. My plays are absolute dog water, and it's hilarious. My brother starts the game with a swamp and passes turn. I start with a tapped Ebon Stronghold and pass back, but he opens up with the hardest turn 2 this deck can offer, a cold Swamp 2 into Hymn to Torok. I exclaim, hell yeah, this is only bad for me, as I had no punishers in hand. The Hymn takes my Omen of the Dead and a Barrow Ghoul, thankfully not taking the only other land in my hand. That would have been tragic. Either way, he draws 2 cards from the Geth's Grimoire. I follow that up with a Barrow Ghoul to hopefully put some early pressure on, but he makes me eat my decisions with a Mortuary Mire, putting the Ghoul from the grave back on top of the deck, removing the fuel from mine. He then proceeds to play a Ghoul of his own, knowing that mine is going to get sacrificed to revive his with fuel instead. In my hand is a Murderous Cut, and I briefly consider strip mining myself to add enough mana to delve fodder to cast it, thus saving my Ghoul. I decide against it, as I really don't have much mana to begin with. However, just after making the wise decision to go Da Vinci mode and crack the most diabolical play, I sacrifice my Ebon Stronghold for 2 mana to cast a Whispers of Emrakul. You see, by sacrificing that land, it puts the 4th card type in the grave, allowing me to have Delirium for the Whispers of Emrakul. This will now draw me 2 cards instead of just 1, likely meaning that I'm going to draw another land and whittle his hand down a bit more. As I cast this, he accidentally reveals a Guerrilla Tactics when randomizing his hand for discard, and I say, I saw Guerrilla Tactics, by the way. Which he replies, no you didn't, but you're about to. And he was unfortunately right, because the 2 cards I flipped were Guerrilla Tactics and Hagra Mauling. Yes, I drew 2 cards, but at the cost of 4 life and my dignity. The best part? I didn't draw any lands off of it. So I guess the version of me who didn't sacrifice the land for Murderous Cut was right after all. It wasn't worth it. I place my head on the table in shame after almost casting the Murderous Cut anyway. So what does my brother do on his turn? Well, after attacking with his creature, he punishes my reluctance to cast Murderous Cut by casting another Hymn to Turok, forcing me to cast it anyway. Cool, thanks man. I do get a consolation prize as he forces me to discard a Guerrilla Tactics of my own, putting him down to 4 hits while I'm at 3 hits until death. I respond by asking nicely if it was my turn yet to draw cards, and his response? Dream Cache and no. My brother allows me to cheat by taking a land that was second from the top instead of the card that was actually on top, so I can finally cast spells. Apparently, he was so far ahead that he didn't even care. I play a wimpy Barrow Ghoul and pass. And you'll never guess what his turn looks like. A Whispers of Emrakul to empty my hand and a Ghoul of his own. I desperately draw and cast a Chainer's Edict to kill his Ghoul and attack him down to even the score at 3 hits left for both of us. He casts another Ghoul on his turn and passes back again, but this time with 4 mana up and the ability to activate a Memorial to Folly. Thankfully, the blessings of Geth show mercy on me and I top deck a Hymn to Torok. Now's my chance to catch back up. I ask if he would let me discard his whole hand, and he politely declines. However, I do make him discard a Whispers of Emrakul, and importantly, a Dockmore Salvage, which he kindly points out I can dredge with my Grimoire trigger. So I do, to finally get my 3rd land. Then I deliberate on attacking by turning my Ghoul into a race car and by making race car sounds. Eventually I do decide to attack. My brother does not block, putting him down to 2 hits left. He gets my last card, another Ghoul, which will hopefully allow my Ghoul to stay alive on my turn. And then he returns the Ghoulish favor, putting me to 2 as well. On my turn, I simply attack. He doesn't block again, which makes me very suspicious, but I pass anyway. And again, he returns a favor by attacking me, putting me to 1 as well. So far, it looks like I might actually win this race, though my car had run out of fuel and I was forced to sacrifice my Ghoul in my upkeep. I draw and pass back with a plan up my sleeve, which is what I would say if my hand weren't two Force of Despairs, so I die and the game ends. But I had a blast either way. The first game we played during this video that was showing in the background was a much closer fight, but I wanted to highlight this one because it was funnier. Alright, and that's that. I don't have a whole lot else to say at the end of this video, but I hope y'all enjoyed this shorter video about another update to an existing deck. I have a couple of other projects coming down the pipeline. We've got a video about playing Elden Ring the wrong way, and one about Yu-Gi-Oh! Ooh, what could that mean? Anyway, see y'all later.